The white minivan rolled into Matamoros in broad daylight, just minutes after crossing from Brownsville. Inside were four Americans from the Carolinas who thought they were making a quick medical trip across the border. Latavia McGee was there for a cosmetic procedure. With her were Eric James Williams, Shade Woodard, and Zindell Brown. They had barely entered the city on March 3, 2023, when the violence found them. A vehicle hit their van. Gunmen in tactical vests and carrying rifles rushed in almost immediately. Shots cracked through the street. People scattered. Cell phone video later showed the wrecked van, the bodies on the pavement, and armed men dragging the surviving Americans into the bed of a pickup truck in the middle of the day. For McGee, the attack ripped the world apart in seconds. She had crossed the border expecting appointments, traffic, and nerves about surgery. Instead, she was trapped in the kind of public violence that turns witnesses into bystanders and bystanders into people who run for cover without looking back. Brown and Woodard were struck during the attack and never made it out alive. Williams was shot in the leg. McGee survived the initial gunfire, but survival only opened the door to the next ordeal. The gunmen loaded her and Williams into a vehicle and drove them away while the bodies of their friends were left behind in a city already known for cartel warfare. A Mexican woman, Arely Pablo Servando, was also killed in the attack. The scene on the road was brutal in its simplicity. Their trip had not involved secrecy or risk-taking in the way outsiders sometimes imagine. They drove in openly, in daylight, through a city where civilians still moved through ordinary streets beneath extraordinary danger. The attack happened so fast that there was almost no space between confusion and catastrophe. One moment, they were travelers in a foreign city. The next, armed men had complete control of the road, the victims, and the pace of what came next. McGee was no longer deciding where to go, who to call, or how to help the friends beside her. Those choices were gone. Her world had narrowed to whatever her captors decided to do in the next minute. The first hours after the abduction were a blur of pain, terror, and confusion. McGee and Williams were wounded, under guard, and in the hands of men they did not know. Investigators later said the captors moved the two survivors through more than one location before taking them to a rural stash site east of the city. That movement mattered because every mile widened the distance between the victims and any quick rescue. The gunmen used ordinary roads and ordinary structures, the way organized criminal groups often do when violence has become routine enough to hide in plain sight. For the victims, that made the captivity even more brutal. The sounds outside might have been vehicles, voices, or doors opening somewhere nearby, but none of it meant help was coming. McGee later described being terrified and trying to stay alive minute by minute. That was the real work of endurance in a kidnapping like this. It was the constant effort to keep panic from taking over while armed men controlled every movement. Williams was wounded, and the possibility that the captors might decide they were worth more dead than alive had to hang over every hour. They were blindfolded for at least part of their captivity. According to investigative documents later reviewed by reporters, when authorities finally reached the place where they were being held, McGee and Williams were beside the bodies of Brown and Woodard, which had been wrapped in blankets and plastic. It was captivity in the presence of proof that the worst had already happened. Back in the United States, relatives were trying to piece together what little was known. The FBI announced a reward and asked for public help. Officials confirmed that 4 Americans had been assaulted and kidnapped after entering Matamoros. News coverage spread fast because the attack had been captured on video and because the victims were ordinary people who had crossed the border for a personal trip and ended up in a cartel zone at exactly the wrong moment. But publicity did not make the search easy. Matamoros sat in Tamaulipas, a state where heavily armed criminal groups, corrupt relationships, and fear could smother a case before outsiders understood what they were looking at. Every hour mattered, and every hour passed without proof that McGee and Williams were still alive. For families, those days became their own kind of captivity. They had names, faces, and a few terrible images, but almost nothing else. Was McGee injured badly enough that she needed emergency care? Were the captors moving her because they were hiding her, selling time, or deciding whether to kill the survivors? Was anyone talking? Was anyone even willing to? Those questions had no immediate answers. Federal officials in two countries were involved, but that did not change the emotional reality for the people waiting by their phones. McGee was somewhere in northeastern Mexico, beyond their reach, wounded and guarded, while the world debated cartel involvement and motives from a distance. The break came on March 7th. Mexican authorities followed information that led them out of Matamoros and onto remote dirt roads toward a crude wooden shack in the rural area east of the city. Outside was a white pickup matching the one seen in the abduction. When officers approached, they began to hear someone yelling in English for help. Inside, they found McGee and Williams alive. One guard was arrested at the scene. Brown and Woodard were found dead nearby. After days of being moved, hidden, and held by gunmen, McGee had lived long enough to hear the sound that finally mattered: law enforcement arriving at the door. Rescue did not erase what had happened. McGee and Williams were brought back across the border into Texas, where they received medical care. Families who had spent days swinging between hope and dread now had to divide their grief. 2 people had survived, 2 had not. McGee had gone to Mexico for medical treatment and returned carrying something far worse than an unfinished procedure. She had survived a daylight attack, watched her group destroyed, and endured captivity in a rural stash location while armed men decided what would happen next. The public saw headlines about a kidnapping. The lived reality was the moment a normal trip collapsed into a scene of gunfire, blood, helplessness, and waiting. Investigators later examined whether the attackers had mistaken the Americans for rival traffickers, but whatever the motive, the facts of the ordeal were already clear. McGee had been one of 4 U.S. citizens ambushed after crossing into Matamoros. 2 members of her group, Shaid Woodard and Zindell Brown, were killed. Eric James Williams survived with injuries. McGee survived the attack and the captivity that followed. Her story held its power because it was not about a narrow escape in some dramatic final sprint. It was about staying alive after control had been taken away, after the street had turned into a killing ground, and after the people with rifles had decided she was coming with them. What happened to Latavia McGee in Matamoros was not a mystery solved neatly from a distance. It was a close-range human disaster that unfolded in public and then vanished into back roads and a stash house. She entered the city alive and unaware, with friends and a plan for the day. Within minutes, 2 of those friends were dead, another was badly wounded, and she was being hauled away by gunmen. Days later, she was found alive in rural captivity, still there to tell the world that the nightmare had been real. She did not simply survive violence, she survived being pulled through it, kept inside it, and found before it could finish the job. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.